Rule 16 of the COL regs forms a central requirement within the global collision avoidance system. It mandates that every vessel identified as the give way vessel must, so far as possible, take early and substantial action to keep well clear. This action must be positive, made in ample time, and be obvious to the other vessel, preventing a close quarters situation from developing. This directly aligns with Rule 8, which sets the general principles for any collision avoidance maneuver. The requirement in Rule 16 to act early and substantial is not just a suggestion, it is a direct command that gets its power from Rule 8, action to avoid collision. Rule 8 sets the non-negotiable standards for how a vessel must act. The rule begins by setting the three main principles for all avoidance maneuvers. It states that any action must be positive, it must be made in ample time, and it must always be with due regard to the observance of good seamanship. First, Rule 8 states that any alteration of course or speed must be large enough to be readily apparent to the other vessel. A small, hesitant turn can be dangerously misleading. Following this, Rule 8b states that any alteration of course or speed must be large enough to be readily apparent to the other vessel. The rule demands decisive action, specifically warning that a succession of small alterations of course and/or speed should be avoided. This is because repeated, tiny moves are poor seamanship. They're confusing, and the other ship can't tell what you're trying to do. Second, the action taken must result in passing at a safe distance. The maneuver isn't complete just because you've turned, it must be effective. The officer must carefully check the action's effectiveness until the other vessel is finally passed and clear. Finally, Rule 8 gives officers a critical tool. If necessary, a vessel shall slacken her speed or take all way off by stopping. Sometimes, the safest action is to slow down and buy more time to assess the situation. Rule 16 becomes operative only after a vessel is identified as the give-way vessel by one of the three main encounter-determining rules. First, Rule 13, overtaking. This rule is absolute. As stated in Rule 13, any vessel overtaking any other shall keep out of the way of the vessel being overtaken. Rule 13b defines this. You are overtaking if you are approaching another vessel from a direction more than 22.5 degrees abaft her beam. At night, this means you would only be able to see the stern light of the vessel ahead, but neither of her side lights. The rule removes all ambiguity. Rule 13c is a critical safety-first principle. When a vessel is in any doubt as to whether she is overtaking another, she shall assume that this is the case and act accordingly. Finally, Rule 13d makes it clear that this responsibility does not change. Even if your bearing changes during the maneuver, you are not relieved of your duty. You remain the give-way vessel until you are finally passed and clear. Second, Rule 14, head-on. This rule applies when two power-driven vessels are meeting on reciprocal or nearly reciprocal courses so as to involve a risk of collision. In this situation, both vessels are considered give way, and each must alter her course to starboard, right, so that they pass port to port, left side to left side. The action is clear and mandatory for both vessels. Rule 14 states that, when two power-driven vessels are meeting on reciprocal or nearly reciprocal courses so as to involve risk of collision, each shall alter her course to starboard so that each shall pass on the port side of the other. In this situation, both vessels are effectively give way. Rule 14b defines how to identify this. Such a situation shall be deemed to exist when a vessel sees the other ahead or nearly ahead, and by night she could see the masthead lights of the other in a line or nearly in a line and or both side lights, and by day she observes the corresponding aspect of the other vessel. Crucially, the rule removes all guesswork. Rule 14c establishes a vital safety-first principle. When a vessel is in any doubt as to whether such a situation exists, she shall assume that it does exist and act accordingly, meaning, you must alter course to starboard. Third, Rule 15 applies to a crossing situation. When two power-driven vessels are crossing so as to involve a risk of collision, the vessel that has the other on its own starboard, right, side is the give-way vessel. That vessel must keep out of the way and, if possible, avoid crossing ahead of the other ship. The rule is very clear. The vessel which has the other on her own starboard side shall keep out of the way. This ship is the give-way vessel. Rule 15 also commands that this vessel shall, if the circumstances of the case admit, avoid crossing ahead of the other vessel. When an encounter rule like Rule 13, overtaking, or Rule 15, crossing, identifies a give-way vessel, it also creates a stand-on vessel. For the early and substantial action of Rule 16 to be safe, it relies entirely on the predictable behavior of that stand-on vessel. Its job is defined by Rule 17, action by the stand-on vessel. Rule 17, A.I. states that the stand-on vessel shall keep her course and speed. This predictability is the foundation that allows the Rule 16, give way, vessel to make its maneuver. But Rule 17 also provides a critical safety net. Rule 17, E, gives the stand-on vessel permission to act. The latter vessel may however take action to avoid collision by her maneuver alone, as soon as it becomes apparent to her that the vessel required to keep out of the way is not taking appropriate action in compliance with these rules. This permission becomes a mandatory duty if the ships get too close. Rule 17, B, is a command. When the stand-on vessel finds herself so close that collision cannot be avoided by the action of the give-way vessel alone, she shall take such action as will best aid to avoid collision. To guide this last-second action, Rule 17, C, gives a specific warning. A power-driven vessel which take action in a crossing situation in accordance with sub-paragraph E of this rule to avoid collision with another power-driven vessel shall, if the circumstances of the case admit, not alter course to port for a vessel on her own port side. A turn to port, left, would likely be into the path of the give-way vessel. Finally, Rule 17, D, provides a crucial legal disclaimer that brings the responsibility full circle, right back to our main topic. It states, this rule does not relieve the give-way vessel of her obligation to keep out of the way. The primary duty always remains with the Rule 16 vessel. Operationally, Rule 16 requires a proactive safety culture. It begins with early risk assessment, using all available means such as radar, ASH, and a proper visual lookout is required by Rule 5. Once a risk of collision is identified, the give-way vessel must execute decisive maneuvering. Minor, hesitant alterations are dangerous. The action must be large enough to be clearly detectable by the stand-on vessel. The give-way vessel's duty is not over until the risk is gone. It must continuously monitor the situation until the other vessel is finally passed and clear. In Malaysia, the international COLREGs are given the full force of national law, primarily through the Merchant Shipping Ordinance 1952, MSO 1952. The key provision is Section 252 of the MSO 1952, titled Collision Regulations. This section formally adopts the COLREGs, stating they shall have effect as if enacted in this ordinance. This makes compliance a binding legal obligation in Malaysian waters. The Marine Department Malaysia, JLM, is the authority empowered to enforce these rules. If an officer fails to comply with these rules, leading to a casualty, JLM has the power to take action. Under Section 75 of the MSO 1952, the Director of Marine can suspend or cancel a seafarer's certificate for incompetence or misconduct, or for being seriously negligent in the discharge of his duties. In summary, Rule 16 is a cornerstone of global maritime safety. It ensures a ship's actions are predictable and safe. Internationally, the IMO creates this uniform standard. Nationally, Malaysia enforces it through the Merchant Shipping Ordinance 1952, using Section 252 to adopt the rules and Section 75 to hold seafarers accountable. Together, this dual legal framework protects lives, property, and the marine environment. Thank you for watching this video. Please like and subscribe.